Hi, my name is Keri, and I am an SRE over at Noble 9. And today I'm going to be tacking on to the SLOs are for everyone train. I was honestly super excited to see that there was an entire track on it this year because honestly, the more and more I learn about SLOs, the more I realize how true that is. There is meaningful data in almost every action we make in our lives, and finding creative ways to put that to use is just absolutely fascinating to me. I could talk for hours about all the ideas I have on how you can use SLOs in your personal life. And if you want to ever talk about those, come find me. But what I'm really here to talk about today is SLOs for business operations. And that sounds pretty cryptic, but what I really mean by that is the discrepancy between how engineering uses SLOs and how everyone else in the company uses SLOs. So let's talk about the data that's meaningful to these other teams and how they can also take advantage of SLOs. This is mostly theoretical right now. Started with a lot of conversations with people I know or have worked with from departments all across the board. And it's really just a way to show how you could think about your data in terms of an SLO. Right now, I haven't seen a lot of services that give an endless amount of integrations or any special endpoints where you could literally send any custom data and make it into an SLO. But I do think that's coming. And there are definitely some creative workarounds in the meantime that you could do if you want to set these up sooner. So again, if you want to talk details, come find me. But we're going to start pretty top level on this because we don't have a lot of time. We've already seen most of this, right? A company exists because there's a problem. Their product solves the problem with designs and ideas. Those designs are built by engineers and put into functioning services. In between that time, marketing and sales will help build your customer base who become the users of your service. And then when those services don't do what your customers are expecting, they ask customer support for help or a feature request. And that feedback gets sent back to product and design, who start that process over again. But outside of that, we have some more employee-centric and company-centric roles. So again, these are very basic top level functions here, but I'm hoping that this conversation will help spark some ideas on how you can use SLOs to monitor the data that's most meaningful to you. So before we dive into them, let's just talk about a couple definitions real quick to make sure everyone's on the same page. So the first one is ratio metric. And I think for a lot of teams, this might be the most straightforward method for you. And a ratio metric is just a percentage of good over total events to get a percentage. On the other end of the spectrum, we have threshold metric, which is really just the lowest acceptable ratio of good over total within a given time window. And in something like this, you can have multiple thresholds on the single query. So let's start with an easy one. Legal. If you have an SLA, well, that's already an SLO, just with legal consequences. So set an SLO to monitor the same services with a little bit of a buffer so that before your SLA is breached, you have some data to help you get ahead of it. But maybe a more unique example here. Let's say you do an SLO on contract renewals. So your query would look something like this. You'll have an amount of contracts that have at least 30 days before the contract renewal date. And you're going to divide that by the total number of contracts. So being on top of these contracts can be very important because you can save the company a ton of money. So let's move on to HR and recruiting. More than ever, I think it's important to keep track of employee mental health because it's been an increasing issue. And one of the biggest factors of that is the amount of time that employees take off to help them reset. And I know so many people, including myself at times, who feel like they can't afford to take time off, paid time off, because they have too many projects going and they can't hand them off. And this is increasingly a problem for companies that are going by the unlimited PTO method. So taking a step in the right direction here, let's track the average PTO for employees. And if it dips below a certain number, like for example, 30 business days, then maybe it's time to start looking at a bigger cultural shift in that company. Security and IT are very near and dear to my heart. So I probably have too many examples with these, but with security, we could start with something like DDoS monitoring. So there's a couple ways we could do this. You could count for a total amount of IPs blocked per second if you have a web app firewall, or maybe just the total throughput, which is effectively just the number or the count of requests made over the amount of time that the request made, the communication time of those requests. If you have a very low amount of requests, but a very high amount of time in those requests, that could tell you that someone malicious is trying to do something like extend their timeout period when loading your site. And if that's the case, they could potentially DDoS you with significantly less resources. And sometimes that can be significantly harder to catch. And then we have things like compliance checks that we could set SLOs for. And then we also have things like vulnerability scans, where we can set a threshold for the total number of detections or threats at any given time. So moving on to IT, which I think oftentimes kind of has this little blurred line between the security role. If your IT team owns some services like single sign-on or Active Directory, it's going to be your IT service health. Because if employees can't get into something, the first person they're going to go to is the IT team. So if we can count the amount of errors on login, for example, for SSO over the total amount of login attempts, maybe we can get ahead of the errors that are happening. And it will also help us differentiate between, is this just happening to you or is it happening to a lot of people? Because that immediately helps you figure out if it's user error, or as I like to call it, educational opportunities, or if there's an environmental error, like one of the IP ranges in your office was somehow blocked by your SSO provider, which has totally happened before. So I could talk for days about troubleshooting theory, but that's a different talk. Next up, we have customer support. So this is one that I've seen from a ton of customer support teams, and that's that there's just no good way for those teams to manage feature requests. Customers are always going to send them in. It's really not a problem for customers to make feature requests as long as you have a means for them to reach your support team. But what does support do with those afterwards? How about they just build an SLO? So most customer support teams that I've worked with use some sort of ticketing service where you can add a tag to a ticket. So maybe we build a little generic list of tags for all the different types of feature requests, and then you send all of that data over to an SLO ratio metric. So each service tag could have its own SLO where we count the number of feature requests per tag over the number of feature requests for all tags. And in that case, we could set a target like, let's say 35%. So if any particular feature request tag has over 35% of the total amount of feature requests, that's a good sign that you might want to revisit that particular feature. And that's one clear piece of information that you can send back to the product team to investigate or add to the roadmap. Moving on to marketing and sales. This is another one where I think the data already exists, but I've seen a lot of teams use these overly complicated spreadsheets that take so much time to update because a lot of the tools for marketing and sales are just way more complicated than I think they need to be. So let's start with some obvious ones, right? We have lead generation. This is the part that connects marketing to sales. So let's make an SLO for every channel that we generate leads. That would be some things like email campaigns, social ads, webinars, conferences. And I know y'all already got goals for all of those. So we can build another ratio metric. Let's use the engagement, which is the total number of interactions with, for example, your social campaign. And we're going to divide that by the total reach, which is the total number of unique views for that social campaign. And then we can set a goal. So maybe we expect our engagement to hit 35% of our total reach. That's our expected objective. And then the best part of it is you can note the date and time for each campaign that was launched and just find all these trends that may not have been as easy to catch from just looking at numbers on your spreadsheet. And, if you're doing great, let's say you are above your 50% of total reach, that gives you some room for chaos engineering or in what you may call A/B testing. And then I just quickly wanted to touch on this one for QA, which I consider part of engineering, but this came up in a conversation recently, and I thought it was too good not to talk about. And that's testing, right? We need testing. I love testing. And it's so worth talking about because a lot of companies don't do it, or they don't do it well, or they just skip it because they're trying to get to production super fast. But QA can help us in SLOs for things like test coverage. So we'll take the total amount of unique tests for a service over the total amount of services. So that should mean that we have at least one test for every service. And we can use that to help measure the coverage that we have on our product for all of the testing. So I know we touched on a very broad spectrum of use cases here for SLOs, but I really hope that this just helps open up the conversations. SLOs are just such a great interdepartmental translation tool. And I just want to highlight, they're not just limited to engineers conversing with other departments. It could totally be the other way around too. So I hope you got a little bit more than you expected here, and you share this talk with some of your friends in other departments who could benefit from something like this. Because again, it's really just goal setting with the idea that you have some data that impacts some customer. And in some form or another, every aspect of the business will have this concept. So let's make SLOs a truly universal language.